thank you again, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Easton White. I'm assistant professor at the University of New Hampshire. For the last few years, I've been at the University of Vermont. So I'm also an affiliate with the Gun Institute for the Environment. So that's why it's really a joy to come back and now be able to present this work. And this is all work that was funded during the time I was at the University of Vermont. It was also funded by a seed grant from the Gun Institute for Environment. And so it's really great to just share this with folks here in this group. A lot of this work is continuing on. So I'm really excited to also talk with folks here because there's so many other angles and opportunities, I think, with some of the data that I'll talk about and just some of the projects related to the work. So one of the amazing things about COVID-19, if there's any silver linings here, is to think about the idea that we have this real-time data to now track and respond to the pandemic. And so if you're like me, you're probably also sick of seeing these dashboards of COVID cases, COVID deaths, whether that be for the US or around the world. And although these numbers are always serving many ways to look at, it's also quite amazing that we can have daily data on the number of cases, the number of deaths, and that allows us to parameterize models on the infectious disease and public health side that try to understand and respond to this pandemic. And this is a global effort by many different groups putting data together and compiling it in ways so that scientists around the world can all be using this data basically live and having this real-time data to respond. And again, coupling that with models as well. And that's really great from the public health side. That's helped a lot for us being able to understand what's going on with COVID-19, being able to respond appropriately. But of course, in addition to the direct effects of the pandemic, whether that be just getting COVID, people are actually getting COVID and deaths associated with that, there's also, of course, many downstream effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these can be good and bad. And so you've heard of lots of these or experienced them yourselves. So this can be things like increased pollution related to PPE, for example, during the pandemic, or changes in environmentally friendly behavior, like things like getting rid of plastic bans during the pandemic. It was a common thing that happened when people were worried about the spread of the disease. But also good things as well, where people getting outside more in parks, people going out and doing more recreational fishing. So a lot of potentially positive aspects and related to that as well is thinking about some of the pollution aspects. So there's a lot of things early on that talked about decreases in air pollution. And these are all, again, this kind of mixed set of effects for these downstream effects of the pandemic. Not to mention all the repercussions for mental health, for people's economic and just personal comfort with where they're at financially and personally. So there's lots and lots of effects beyond just the pandemic itself. A lot of that obviously having to do with how we close down after the pandemic, and then the effects of those closures on all these other things that we think about. And so that led me to some work thinking about how the pandemic might be affecting seafood and fisheries. So I've been doing some work early on in the pandemic, more related to public health and infectious disease. And at the same time, I'd always been doing some work related to seafood and fisheries. And then quite naturally, I was starting to combine some of those interests together. This was basically about a year ago, last March, and thinking about how these things come together. So thinking about, okay, well, if we're seeing these shutdowns on the pandemic side, how is that going to affect things that I often think about, especially related to marine and ocean systems? And so why might this be particularly relevant for seafood and fisheries? I'm just comparing it to different industries. In the US, 65% of all spending on seafood takes place in restaurants. And so this is a huge amount of spending and just a lot of demand that's in restaurants. And of course, during the pandemic, restaurant sales basically collapsed. There's been a lot of seafood and just general restaurant delivery services that have sprung up from that. But again, this is a huge part of the seafood network that's different than other sources of food. The US is also both a top exporter and importer of seafood, and that makes it especially susceptible to these types of shocks, where if you have a particular product, let's say monkfish in New England or something, that might be destined for a lot of export sales, that's going to be really hurt during the pandemic if you're really relying on those types of exporting and importing of seafood. Fisheries are often very seasonal as well. And so when we think about if you were a fishery that was just about to get underway last year when the pandemic was starting, or if you're thinking on the aquaculture side of starting to set up whatever farming that you were doing for that year, the particular timing of those events is really important. And so that can be really affected by something like a pandemic, where it's going to have these really stringent effects that are going to be very seasonal as well. So yeah, not only are fisheries seasonal, but also if you've ever been on a fishing boat, it can be very hard to follow things like social distancing guidelines. So if you think about being out at sea for days or weeks at a time on a very small boat, the idea of wearing masks when it's wet, and when you think about just like the interaction with your crewmates, that can be very, very difficult. And so we've seen that all over. And we've seen other effects of fisheries where a lot of fisheries, because they are seasonal, that involves a lot of migrant workers going into those fisheries as well. And so there's a lot of things tied up there related to public health limitations and restrictions that were also placed on folks during the pandemic. And then, of course, I won't really hit on this during this talk, but just the general importance of seafood for protein and micronutrients as well. This is really important, especially for small-scale fisheries and subsistence fisheries. Again, I won't really talk about that here. I'll be focusing on the US, but there's a lot of implications that we're just also trying to unravel now related to some of the questions of seafood importance during COVID, but in particular in the developing country context. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, as things started taking off, I was connecting with a few other collaborators that were interested in ideas around shocks and these disturbance events, and COVID-19 being just one example of that. And unfortunately, a lot of fisheries data that would be really useful during this kind of emerging event is either missing or it takes months or even years to produce. So this is very basic data, like how much fish are we catching? Very useful bit of information, but that data takes a long time to process and is not released by various groups that organize and collect that data for many, many months later. Even though it's collected, almost at real time, in most places it's not released immediately. And so that makes it really hard if you want to understand something about how the pandemic is affecting fisheries, and then how you might actually respond to that. So in the sense of federal government or state governments responding financially or with particular restrictions. And so that led us basically out of necessity to turn the novel data sources to try to understand something about what was happening across the seafood pipeline. And so again, the focus here is really going to be on US seafood and fisheries, because although data is limited everywhere, we had some interesting data streams that I'll talk about moving on that was really interesting to study in the US seafood context. And so one of the first really interesting sources of just types of data you can use here is using what's people have used in the past, these news article databases. These are often manually curated, but this is one that's organized with the GDELT project, which basically collects all the different news publications published around the world in all these different languages. And what you can do is you can track this over time, and you can say, look through this database and say, well, how often are people talking about COVID, but also talking about seafood, for instance? And so this is just a graph of the US, of the number of articles published in the US that are dealing with various search terms around seafood and COVID. And so there's a lot of articles published early on in early January around a lot of the trade disruptions, basically because of the pandemic starting in China, that there was a lot of interruptions in trade, and that was it's a major export market for the US. And then those articles died down a little bit. And again, these are hundreds and thousands of articles that we're talking about across the US being published. And then as the pandemic takes off in the US, we get all these restaurant closures start happening. And that's when a lot of articles start getting published about seafood. It's just recognizing the importance of restaurants in the seafood industry. And then there's various things going on during the summer. The US CARES Act is signed. That includes funding for fisheries and seafood. And then also there's a lot of changes also related to recreational fishing. So more people were going out fishing because people wanted to do something outside, was a big part of it. A lot of shift to direct-to-consumer marketing as well, which I'll get into a little bit later. But basically, seafood outlets changing where they're distributing seafood in particular ways to meet consumer demand. There's also a lot of outbreaks that are happening at this time in various seafood processing facilities in particular, not so much on fishing vessels, but on these processing facilities where you can imagine people packed into these tight quarters and having to process seafood. It just has really strong potential to have these outbreaks. So that's over time. You can also look at this information spatially as well, and you can just see that there's differential impacts across the US. So a lot of news articles being published in the Northwest, in Alaska, in the Northeast, places that are really reliant on fisheries and seafood. So that's just kind of a broad scale course view of things. We also dug into a subset of the articles. We couldn't look at, actually read all, several thousand articles. But if you dig into that a little bit, I won't get into the details here, but you can start getting into thinking about more fine scale differences related to how much of these articles were reporting on capture fisheries versus aquaculture, for example. How often were they reporting on small scale versus industrial fishing? I think what's most interesting here to talk about is the different types of products. So we see a lot of articles being published on things like live and fresh seafood, because those are related to the restaurant sales. So those are going to be hit really hard during the pandemic. Where things like canned tuna, there's not a lot of news articles being published on that. But the articles that were being published were talking a lot about how early in the pandemic, people were turning the dry goods like canned tuna. And that was being bought up a lot. And so the markets for frozen fish and for canned seafood as well did really well during early on in the pandemic, because people were buying not just a whole bunch of toilet paper, but also a lot of these canned goods as well. Another really interesting data stream that I think has been underexplored in this context, thinking about consumer demand, is Google search history. And so you can look at Google trend information about what consumers are searching for. You can do this by country, by state, and we were dug into this. This is for the entire US. And what you can see here is that I have a couple different search terms, so seafood restaurant, seafood delivery, a couple other ones. And not surprisingly, when the pandemic starts, in particular in the US, that's where this vertical red line is. This is when it's declared a pandemic in the US, that you see this huge drop in demand for people searching for seafood restaurants. This is the same thing that happened in barbecue restaurants as well, which is kind of a control, that you see this huge drop in demand, just people not going out to restaurants generally. But what was really interesting is for the restaurants in particular, barbecue restaurants respond back quite quickly. So going into the summer, that people are searching for that again, well, it takes a lot longer for seafood to be actually recovered, for people's interest in seafood to recover. What was really cool to see is that, yeah, the demand for seafood restaurants was decreasing, but there's all these interesting alternative modes of demand. So seafood delivery, people searching for seafood recipes as a kind of a metric for your home cooking, and then sushi takeout. So these things that you don't typically associate seafood with delivery and cooking at home. It's not something that American consumers feel all that comfortable with. Or sushi takeout, just not that common. And we saw these increase a lot during the pandemic and actually stay elevated for quite some time. And so it's going to be really interesting moving forward to see if any of those new lines of demand and being able to get these products out there continue on past the pandemic or not, or people just want to go back to eating seafood in restaurants. One of the most interesting data streams that is definitely underused, and I really would be curious to chat with folks here about other opportunities to use this data. So the graph that I have here, this is foot traffic data via GPS pings from people's cell phones. And so you can just see the large difference in this case for seafood markets. We looked at 3,000 seafood markets across the US and just basically added those up. So this is just daily usage of these seafood markets. And not surprisingly, you get this huge drop in 2020 because of the pandemic. So not surprising, but I think there's a lot of interesting potential with this type of data. So this is foot traffic data. It comes from basically apps on your phone. So whether that be Uber or Lyft or other companies collecting some kind of information about your GPS locations. They sell that information to other companies that anonymize it and repackage it in ways that then they can sell to other companies that they can use that to understand something about the foot traffic in their business. And it's now being released to researchers as well to be using. So what this information includes is basically the amount of traffic through different institutions, whether that be a seafood market or a restaurant or a grocery store, or even like a nature park, things that have like a physical location, how much traffic is there through those places. And so this has been used a lot in public health, especially during COVID, where really wanting to understand how much traffic and how much people are interacting with one another. But I think it has all these other cool and interesting potential projects for thinking about things more related to the environment as well. Of course, that's just looking at the entire US. You can also break this up by state. Just look at, this is the proportional change from 2019 to 2020. And not surprisingly, so the places in dark red here, that's where you had a large reduction in foot traffic. And things were actually looking quite good for seafood markets early on in 2020. But as soon as the pandemic hit, basically everywhere that you can look at, there was a huge drop in markets, in seafood markets in particular. And we see this with lots of different things, whether that be other types of restaurants or other types of businesses, that you see this reduction of foot traffic because of all the social distancing restrictions. What's really interesting about this data is that this is looking at it for the US scale and then per state. You can also look at it for individual seafood markets or individual businesses. You can also look at this foot traffic for. So again, there's just a lot of possibilities of how you can use this data. What was really interesting during the pandemic as well is that a lot of different groups basically emerged during this time or took off during this time to try to promote alternative modes of doing business. And this was really relevant for seafood and fisheries, where people weren't being able to sell to restaurants or weren't being able to sell to export markets. So there's a lot of emphasis on thinking about more local distribution and just these alternative modes of selling products. And so one of these websites is localcatch.org. It's a really great site because you can go on here, you can just see who locally is selling seafood. And you can just find your local fisherman, your local aquaculture producer, and figure out who's selling seafood and really focus more on these local markets. And so a lot of organizations joined this website early on in the pandemic to basically try to promote these types of local, local distribution. This includes things like community-supported fisheries. And so this is basically like a farm CSA, but for fisheries, where you're buying in, you're getting a weekly box of fish. Also direct-to-consumer sales, so people literally selling fish off of their boats or on docks directly to consumers. That involved a lot of laws changing as well in various places, which is really interesting to see how people responded there. And then, of course, it's a shift to frozen products more generally of saying, well, if I can't sell things fresh, I'm going to can or freeze things as well. Again, that's an investment in equipment and such that has to go into that, but just another way people were able to pivot during the pandemic. What was really interesting is if you look at all the seafood market data that I showed you earlier, so we see this huge drop in 2020. This is the same data that I showed earlier for the 3,000 seafood markets. If you compare those to these players that were involved in really thinking about local marketing, so that are within this local catch network, again, this is a much smaller sample, they were actually not nearly as strongly affected by the pandemic as all these other seafood markets. There's a lot of things to unpack here and try to unravel and figure out more details, but you can just see that 2020 actually looks quite similar to 2019 for that limited set of businesses that are really focused on community-supported fisheries and more local sales, which is just an encouraging way of thinking about how things can move forward during the pandemic, but also after the pandemic, of shortening these supply chains and the seafood pipeline and really focusing more on local production and demand. And that's a lot of re-education of American consumers as well, where American consumers are really happy to eat basically cod, salmon, shrimp, and tuna. And that's kind of the big four. Anything else that's a little bit weird, American consumers don't really like eating. So there's a lot of re-education around convincing people what they can and what they could eat, and also how to prepare that at home, for example, where people just aren't as comfortable with that usually. What was really interesting as well with a lot of this work is that it was really cool to see the broader impacts of how people responded to our publications. We had a couple of publications related to this work now, how people responded to it. And it was really encouraging that it got picked up in large part because of interactions with Gunn and other folks at the University of Vermont, and then a couple other institutions with the different scientists that were involved in the project. But ultimately, this was picked up by over 200 news outlets. It was even cited in policy documents. And so it's now one of the most referenced papers if you look at various metrics related to coverage by the popular media. As I mentioned, it's also in policy documents. So this is the Congressional Research Service that highlighted this work early on in the pandemic as being one of the things that was really an important part of understanding how federal aid would be distributed moving forward, thinking about seafood. And what's really cool about this is that this report was released in September 21st. Our paper, because of the peer review process, took a long time to get through peer review, was not actually published till November of last year. But because we had released results as a preprint on a preprint server, our findings were actually released in May and then updated in June and July. And that's how people in Congress and other folks in the media were able to pick up on our research, even though it hadn't officially made it all the way through the peer review process. And so I think it's just a really valuable reflection on how open science and reproducible science can allow your work to be seen by a broader audience and then have other impacts down the road. So it led to a lot of other interesting collaborations with other folks who are working on similar topics. Then we can kind of collaborate and join efforts on this. There's also been a lot of different surveys that have been done thinking about not just how much seafood demand there is or how much production in seafood there has been, but the more specific effects on local and small scale seafood producers and fishermen in general. And so this is a report put together by NOAA in January of this year. And basically they went on and interviewed a bunch of people and asked them how the COVID pandemic was affecting them in particular. And this is really great, and I'll explain the results here. But I will note, this is in January 2021, right? So this doesn't help us respond to the event itself. It's basically a postmortem of what happened for a lot of folks involved in the industry, which is really valuable. But getting these types of surveys and different data sets out there really, really early in the pandemic, that's where we can actually then use that information to manage and respond to the event itself. So thinking about, just take one example, it's a huge report. It's hundreds of pages of information of these surveys. But thinking in the Northeast in particular, fishing is a primary source of income for 63% of commercial harvesters. And so it's just hard for people to pivot to other modes of financial means, especially when things are so seasonal, as I've mentioned. 78% of commercial harvesters had to stop fishing for some period of time. So that's not surprising, just given the social distancing restrictions and the lack of demand from the restaurant side. But what was encouraging, at least at the time of this survey, less than 1% of these businesses had gone out of business. And so a lot of people were being hurt by it, but at least we don't see these widespread business closures of people actually giving up fishing, giving up aquaculture business. And I think a lot of that probably stems from the fact that seafood and fisheries in general have had to deal with a lot of shocks and a lot of big disturbance events in the past. And this feels like another one of those. This is obviously a huge one and it's unprecedented in many ways. But I think these industries in particular have had to deal with events like this in the past and haven't been able to make it through. Some other top reported impacts that people talked about in these surveys, they were instructed not to fish by dealers and processors, just saying that there wasn't demand, so they should stop fishing. Of course, low prices for fish. That's related to both the restaurant sales and again, the export markets. And then just a general lack of markets and buyers as well. And so that's kind of the big picture of, at least in the Northeast, what's happening, and there's similar trends elsewhere in the US. And you can also look at the specific dollar value that's attached to this. And so this graph is just showing you the revenue over time and the cumulative change in revenue from previous years. And so not surprisingly, there's a huge drop in revenue across all these fisheries. What's really interesting is when you dive into the details of particular areas or particular species, there's all these fine scale differences. And so, for example, we think about fisheries in the Northeast, some of the largest declines here were for things like scallops, surf clam, monkfish, a lot of fisheries that are going to be heavily exported that saw big effects here. But again, it's going to vary depending on species. And so we're now just trying to get into the details of why it varies for particular species or for particular types of businesses, particular locations, not just in the US, let alone a lot of other places as well. And I haven't even hinted and gone into all these effects that beyond just these revenue effects, the effects of mental health effects on fishermen and seafood workers, and all these other downstream effects that are going to be creeping up for and have an effect for many years. So just a couple conclusions. The effects from the pandemic have been felt throughout the entire seafood pipeline, and that's everything from demand to production. But these effects have not been the same everywhere. So some places have done well, depending on what they were catching. So if you're catching tuna and you're processing canned tuna, you probably did well during the pandemic early on. And I think the work really highlights the need for data, even if they're novel and kind of strange data sets, so things like Google search history. But we need this data to support decision-making during these emerging events. We can't wait months or years to get, for example, fish landings data. we need to have this data released more quickly so we can actually use that to respond both scientifically and from the response side from the government for things like the CARES Act and other government plans that provided some money for seafood. That we need information early on to actually make those decisions in the best possible way. And again, I talked only about the US here. We really need more work obviously done on fisheries in developing countries where in those cases, a lot of it is still thinking about export markets and sales for things, but a lot thinking about actually nutrition and protein in these developing countries. So a few things for future work that hopefully will stir some conversation going into the after this talk. This foot traffic data is a really great data set that has not been used a lot outside of the public health world. And so just like very basic things of how many people are visiting nature parks, for example. I know a lot of people in the Gun Institute have thought about that, but we also have this data for every nature park in the US, how many people are visiting it on a daily basis. And so there's lots of potential projects there. There's projects around how many people are in and around ports, how many people are in restaurants. Again, all these types of institutions and businesses, basically anything that has a physical location, we have information for how many people are using those businesses. And again, some more fine scale analyses around specific fisheries. So why were some fisheries more affected by COVID than other fisheries? How's it affecting things like aquaculture, which I've barely talked about because we don't have very good data on aquaculture typically. And so getting into some more specific analyses there. And then we're now starting some new work thinking about industrial fishing really on a global scale, using meeting with folks from Global Fishing Watch, and really thinking about how industrial fishing has changed by using satellite-derived information about how much fishing is happening around the world. So this is a new project that's just starting, and so there's lots of things to dig into there with the foot traffic and lots of other work. And so with that, I'll take any questions. Hopefully, yeah, we have lots of time for questions. And thank you all again for attending today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your talk. That was really interesting. I certainly learned a lot about how the pandemic has impacted the U.S. seafood fishery. So thanks for sharing your current research. I'll kick us off with a question, and I already see some questions coming in through the Q&A box, so keep them coming, everybody. My first question is related to one of your earlier slides about how the canned or frozen segments of the seafood industry are being impacted differently than the live and the fresh segments. And I'm wondering if there are different supply chains associated with those different segments and how that differential impact could impact the sustainability of either global or US seafood fisheries.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there's certainly going to be different supply chains for those. Like if you think about something like tuna, it's going to have to be a very different supply chain than something like salmon. And so definitely different. I don't know in the exact ways that they do differ, but that is what makes it really hard. You can't just pivot really quickly to a different type of production. So a lot of the emphasis early on was like, oh, well, if you're catching this one fish, now just like freeze it or dry it out or something, but you can't just pivot that quickly. So I think that could have really big implications down the road of where there's a lot of demand for those types of products, but maybe not other products. So I think that's a great question, but I have to look at more of the details around how the seafood actually flows through those different supply chain networks. Good question.
Cool, thanks. Our first question is, do you think that the lack of fishing this year will affect the fish communities in the greater marine food web? I imagine that less fishing would increase the fish populations and therefore they would require more resources which may not be available.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the question that I get from a lot of journalists as well of, is this going to be this big global slowdown essentially, where there's been this big slowdown in fishing, and is that going to have these major effects down the road? I'm not sure. And so I think my guess at the moment of what's going to happen is I think it's going to be a small impact long term, where I think it's going to be a blip of this one past year. That's not going to have a big impact for overall global fisheries in general. I think it can have very, very strong impacts on particular locations or particular fisheries. But I think there's a lot more work to be done there. But I don't think it's going to be as simple as a story of saying, oh, there's this reduction in fishing for this year. It's going to have major effects for all the world's oceans moving forward. And so I'm not really sure what's going to happen. I think it's a great question. but I think there's a lot more work to be done there. And it's often compared to past events that kind of on this global scale, like World War II, for example, where everyone references World War II as being this big global slowdown in fishing across the world because people were at war. That was obviously a lot longer of a period, and so that's what had a lot of these booms in fishery stocks after that. My guess is that we're not going to have the same type of effect now, though that we'll see. We'll certainly see how that plays out in the next few years. But good question.
This next question is from Taylor Ricketts, and he writes, I'm sorry I joined a few minutes late, so maybe you said this, but what led you to focus on the seafood industry? Was it a research interest already or an industry you thought was particularly vulnerable? And how do you think your findings generalize to other industries such as meat, veggies, lumber, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. A few things there. I mean, I was definitely already interested in the seafood industry and fisheries just generally, and so that's definitely part of it. And some of it was definitely the idea that seafood could be different than other industries. So obviously, every industry has been affected by COVID-19 in some in really bad ways and some in good ways. And so thinking about seafood in particular, the conditions that you work in seafood with really close quarters, really long hours. Again, this is similar to things like meat processing, for example, but also the seasonal nature of seafood makes things really hard. So a lot of factors that I think could make seafood particularly susceptible. That's also related to the focus on restaurant sales and export sales for seafood, which is just different from some other markets. And so that was definitely some of the emphasis to think about seafood in particular. We haven't really done much work yet on comparing the effects of seafood compared to other types of industries. A lot of people have published on the effects in the meat industry is a big one, and then there's just agriculture industries generally. But I haven't seen good analyses kind of crossing across those sectors, and I think that would be really interesting to do more work there because from my side, like seafood feels particularly affected, but I think everyone feels like their industry is particularly affected by COVID. So I think it'd be really interesting to see kind of the scale and the magnitude of that and how that compares, both from a production and supply chain set of questions, but also more on the ground of thinking about how people have actually been affected in those industries. So how have COVID outbreaks been similar or different in meat packing industry versus fish processing industry? So very, very similar work conditions in many ways, but could have different impacts for what's happening there, whether that be the direct health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic or all these downstream effects related to just actual like fiscal, like how much money people are bringing in, how that has been affected with job losses, for example, but also just other mental health and other indirect effects of the pandemic. So long answer, I'm not sure how it compares to other industries, but I think that would be a really interesting set of questions.
Great, thank you. I had a question related to the impacts of your research on policy. You mentioned that a little bit, and you also mentioned the preprint process and that how that impacted your ability to influence policy. So I guess there's kind of two questions in there. One is just, could you elaborate more on the impacts of the study on shaping policy as it relates to the pandemic or more broadly, but then also could you just elaborate more on the preprint process and whether or not you see that as something that is needed or valuable in terms of shaping conversations beyond academia?
Yeah, great set of questions. So one, from the policy side, so we had this work coming out very early, and without even doing very very detailed analysis, it was very clear that there's interesting results coming out of the work. So we knew that we wanted to get the results out there quickly. But a lot of I think the impact that we had thinking about the policy side was putting a lot of emphasis and energy into thinking about policy. So it wasn't something that we just published a paper and they said, oh, let's hopefully policymakers will just read our paper and then they'll change all their policies. Like that's not the approach that was going to work. So there's a lot of discussions really early on with people in policy, for example, in the Congressional Research Service, reaching out to folks and like finding specific individuals that we knew would be influential and sharing this result. So this was sharing these results with folks at NOAA, as folks with NIMS, in the federal government generally, and also on the local, more state side, just folks that we knew and had built relationships with. And connected to that was also a lot of work for weeks and weeks and weeks, thinking about how we would pitch this to media outlets and how we would get, what messages we wanted to get across as a whole team distributed across the US and Canada, of how we wanted to share these results. And so there was a lot of work put into how to make the press releases share the messages that we wanted and how we would target that for policymakers. And so that was kind of a lot of the back end of what was happening. And we had this very, I would say, more sciencey classic peer review paper. And we also had this companion paper that was still a peer reviewed publication, but it was focused a lot more on the policy side and had a lot more very clear ideas around, in that particular case, 5 different ideas around how to change policy during this big shock event of the pandemic and how things will move forward. So yeah, long answer to say, there's a lot of different pieces that were going in there. We spent a lot of time as a team, this group of co-authors, in conjunction with our press offices and the press office at Gunn as well, really trying to coordinate those efforts. And it just takes a lot of time and energy to really make that work well. To your other question about open science and preprints, so preprints have been around for a long, long time, for many decades, but mostly in the math and physics communities. And it's basically a way that when your paper, essentially around the time that you're about to submit your paper to a journal for review, you might post a preprint, which is just in a repository that publishes an early view of that paper. And so that's a really nice way that you can kind of have it out there while it's still in the peer review process, which might take months or years. And you can always update that preprint later. But what's really nice about it, and I think a lot of people realized the value of it during the COVID pandemic, is that information needed to get out there. And you couldn't wait 6 months for it to go out there because it wasn't going to help influence decisions that were being made. And so getting it out as a preprint, our paper, we had started working on it in March, and we had a preprint available in early May. So like 6 weeks, basically, to what was a publication worthy preprint. Again, it hadn't gone through the peer review process, just internal review, but it was out there in May. It went through the peer review process. And then months and months of that, we were updating the preprint online and updating the data as well. So a lot of thinking about open science and reproducibility, of just sharing our information so anyone could download our data, download the code, and have access to the preprint for months and months before our paper was actually ended up being published. And having that preprint out there also allowed us to connect with other groups that were doing similar work. And then we collaborated. So this other paper with folks thinking about local seafood distribution, we would not have known of each other if we had not each put a preprint online and then ended up collaborating together on some other work. So a lot of cool connections were made just by posting these preprints early on.
That's really interesting. Thank you. For everyone who's joined us, I encourage you all to put your questions in the Q&A box. And right now I'm not seeing any new questions, so I'll ask another one of my own. But again, please put your questions in the box and we can keep the conversation going. I'm wondering what you see as the relationship between planetary health and human health. Some of your interest slides alluded to that a little bit. And is there value in messaging issues that may be perceived as solely environmental issues through a human health lens? Yeah,
I think that's a great question. And so I think really talking about this, and obviously lots of folks here have thought about this, of pulling all these connections together, that when you think about something like seafood in particular, there's just such clear implications for how that relates to CO2 emissions, because you have to have vessels that go out and use gasoline to go get fish, how that ties into nutrition elements and how that affects human health ultimately, how the pandemic plays into that as well. So I think it's really important that really actually present that entire holistic story. I'd say in our first paper, we didn't do a lot of that. It was a lot of this focus on just what was happening in the seafood pipeline. And we didn't put as much an emphasis on kind of that more holistic picture. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, especially around fisheries and seafood production, whether that be in a developing country context or in a developed country context, what that looks like and how that differs. But I think there's a lot of work to do there. So I think that's a great question that, we should probably think more about, not just from the scientific side, but also the messaging side.
Awesome, thank you. It sounds like your team has been doing a lot of thinking about messaging and some context through all your media outreach and policy outreach as well. So it's really interesting hearing kind of the broader outreach sides of your research as well.
I think it's always useful to remember there as well that there is scientific literature around how to best communicate and influence, what people are thinking in the general public. So going in and reading some of that literature, I think, can also be a really valuable way to just get a better understanding of how you can have your message have the most impact.
Absolutely. We have a question here from Taylor Ricketts, and it says, did your preprint and the attention it got affect the peer review process? Did the journal balk at media attention ahead of acceptance?
That's a great question. So this definitely varies a little bit journal to journal. So for a long time, a lot of journals wouldn't even accept preprints. Like if you had posted it somewhere as a preprint, they didn't want to publish it in their journal because it had stolen some of the thunder or something. That has definitely changed in the last few years. And so almost every journal I know of, especially in fields that might be related to the environment, have shifted to allowing preprints submission. It's definitely something worth looking into, but it's hard for me to even think of any that don't allow preprints to be submitted. Then there's the question of they allow you to submit it, but does it? How do they feel about it? In the journal that we had targeted, they loved that it was out as a preprint already. Like they knew in some ways that it had been vetted in some ways, where thousands of people had read that preprint or had downloaded that preprint before it had gone all the way through the peer review process. It just has another large set of eyes on that. And we corrected things, not in the peer review process, but from the open peer review process by everyone being able to read it. And so even though it had got media attention before it was actually published as a publication, we didn't get any flack from the journal or anything about that. So they still really appreciated it. And we know that if you post things as preprints, you end up getting higher citations down the road anyway. So a journal doesn't really care if it's just all together you have more citations and more interest in that paper. I think that journal just sees that all as positives. So that might differ a little bit by the journal and the editors at various journals, but we had a really good experience with that.
Thank you. As somebody who has yet to go through the publishing process, your insight on this is really valuable to me and hopefully to other students who are joining us today. Yeah,
definitely. And yeah, always happy to talk about these things too. And there's open access librarians on campus that talk about these things around the different routes for this. So there's lots of different options, and depending on your field, things might be slightly different. But yeah, there's definitely some things to learn about the preprint and publication process related to that. But I think it can be really beneficial for a lot of your work.
Great, thank you. I have another question for you, this time looking a little bit forward to your future work. You mentioned a few things that you were excited about going forward in terms of data availability and what you could do with some of the location data, for example. And I'm just curious to hear more about the future direction of your research, whether it's related to this project in particular or other ways that you envision using data to inform questions related to the seafood industry in general, or also public health, since you mentioned you'd work on that as well.
Yeah, and so, yeah, great question. And so I'm interested in lots of different things. And so that's always the issue, that there's too many things to work on and not enough time. And some of that is driven by the questions that I have related to seafood and fisheries and how things might be affected. And then basically we go find the data to answer those questions. And then some questions emerge quite naturally from having these data sets and saying, oh, what can we explore about that? So I think it's a bit of a mix between those two lines of thinking, where, for instance, like I said, we have this foot traffic data for all these different institutions and businesses. And there's just so much information you could gather there around, for example, like I talk about natural parks and just nature parks around the US, of how those foot traffic has changed in those parks, for example, which would be really cool. Just to dive into more questions there. On the other side of it, looking at something like foot traffic and seafood markets, that's really cool. And that gives you some kind of, I think, really cool broad view of how demand might be changing for seafood in the US generally. But what that doesn't get into is the more species-specific effects and maybe more specific locations. So trying to understand, okay, that's what's happening on the seafood demand side. How does that go all the way down to thinking about how that might affect ecosystem level dynamics? So I think there's a lot of work that will come out, basically because we need a little bit more time to get some of that information, but connecting really from this entire socio-economic side all the way to the environmental and ecological side, and really trying to connect those pieces together. So there's a lot more work to be done there. And a lot of that is limited because of data limitations, but trying to find new and interesting ways that pull in data sets that can be used to answer questions along that entire continuum would be really great.
Thank you. Since you're recently starting at University of New Hampshire, are there particular fisheries in New Hampshire or New England in general that you're interested in exploring more related to your desire to learn more about how particular fisheries were impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of my work has been on these either countrywide or regional wide, but kind of big course analyses. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be digging into some things more locally. And so we have a few proposed projects for thinking about New Hampshire and New England fisheries in general, related to COVID, but also just other questions generally. What has become really apparent in the last couple of years is the huge interest and demand for aquaculture products. And so just knowing that with a lot of our fisheries, we might not be getting more fish out of many of our fisheries. It's not the case everywhere, but just knowing that aquaculture is going to be a huge player. It already is a huge component of fish production in the US, or in the world generally, but not as much in the US. And so there's going to be a lot more of that. That's a big thing in New Hampshire as well, and in New England generally. But there's been a lot of actions by, in particular, the federal government lately to try to push more aquaculture, both in scientific terms, trying to understand how we can do it well, whether that be offshore aquaculture or things more closer to shore, or things on land as well. And so trying to understand that both scientifically, but also trying to understand what that will look like from a production and demand side as well. I think there's a lot of interesting questions related to that that would be really cool to dive more into.
Awesome, thank you. You mentioned that you worked with a large team on this project, and that when we were talking before this, you didn't necessarily know everyone on the team before. And so I'm just kind of wondering how this project actually came together, especially across different universities or with people across disciplines as well.
Yeah, great question. So I, like I had mentioned, I was originally working on more just public health related questions related to the pandemic to start. And that was involved using some foot traffic data. And that's kind of how I got involved using that data. And then I said, oh, I wonder how that's affecting seafood and fisheries. So I just was basically looking at how that affected various businesses that might matter for seafood. So that's kind of how it got sort of pivoting there. And then I said, okay, well, this is interesting. I wonder what other people are thinking about this. And I just basically started reaching out to people, basically cold calling people that I hadn't worked with before. But I said, oh, well, this person is an expert on seafood trade, so I'm going to contact them. This person is an expert on aquaculture. I'm going to contact them. And I just started like literally cold calling people and cold emailing people saying, hey, do you want to chat about this? And they said, oh, actually, I've been thinking about this, but I haven't really dug into it. And very quickly, we had scientists from across the US and Canada that were experts in these different areas, and really brought together all these different data sets as well, of saying, well, thinking about trade data and thinking about the search history data online, thinking about, again, the foot traffic data. So pulling all these different data sets together to try to really understand this complete pipeline. So it was cool to bring in people that I hadn't met before. And now we have tons of collaborations and potential projects together moving forward. But a lot of that, yeah, was just cold emailing people who were also excited about the ideas. And then we slowly started chatting about it and ended up working together quite dispersed. We still haven't met each other for the most part. And so it's really cool to have these several papers now produced by this team that came together quite organically in many ways. But it was it was a fun process to develop that, and just made a lot of great connections through that process.
That's really neat and cool to hear about I think it takes some level of courage to just reach out to people and say, hey, I want to work with you. Let's chat more.
Sure.
So it's awesome that the project worked out well.
Yeah, no, yeah, very, very happy with how it worked out. And there's certainly people that like I would contact and say, oh, that sounds really cool, but like, too busy because there's a global pandemic happening. So it was one of those, it was really for the people who had some bandwidth that maybe drop projects for temporarily and maybe work on this in this kind of short sprint. Like it certainly was hard for a lot of people, obviously, to be working on this kind of science. I dropped a lot of my own projects just to focus on COVID for a while. So so it's really not easy to pivot that quickly, but it was nice to have some flexibility to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'll follow up with something you mentioned in your presentation, which was about fisheries dealing with shocks in the past. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about any particular shocks to U.S. fisheries that you know about, and how fishermen and other related industries have dealt with them, and what contributes to resilience within U.S. fisheries.
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a NSF proposal in right now to basically look at thinking about not just COVID, but just shocks in general. And so it's definitely something we want to think about shocks generally, about how different characteristics of different shocks, how they might affect these systems. So that can be something like an oil spill is going to act very differently than a hurricane, for example. They might still have effects on fisheries, but one might be more ecological, one might be more on this economic social side as well. And so might have more direct or indirect effects. And so that's what we're really interested in moving forward with, is thinking about kind of this big picture scope around different types of disturbances, different types of events, and then translating that down to particular fisheries and trying to understand how some fisheries might respond better or worse. And so if you think about something like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, this is a huge event that's going to affect a lot of really valuable fisheries there. And there's still people still unpacking all the various effects there. So I think there's a lot more work to do around that, whether that be, again, oil spills, I think is just a particularly interesting one because there's this big, immediate, direct disturbance event to that area, but also there's going to be lingering effects for many, many years. But also the more economic consequences of, you think about like the 2008 economic collapse in the US, that is a huge economic collapse that could also have environmental effects as well. And so we're really trying to understand how different types of shocks and shocks that affect different parts of that entire socio-ecological coupled system, how shocks in different parts of that basically find their way through that entire system and affect multiple things. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of good questions there, and really comparing all these different types of shocks and using analyses we developed for COVID specifically, then just applying them back in the past and looking at other shocks or shocks that might be upcoming as well.
Do you expect COVID-19, the shocks related to this pandemic, to have the same sort of long-term effects that maybe an oil spill would? Or do you expect this to be, you mentioned this might be kind of a blip in terms of fisheries stocks, but do you think it'll also be a blip for the consumer side of this issue?
That's a good question. And there's definitely a lot of interest in what is going to be a blip and what might stay around. And so things like giving particular fisheries might not change a lot during this time. But for things like consumers being more used to, let's say, local fisheries where they might be more comfortable preparing monkfish or some other fish at home. I always pick on monkfish, but preparing fish products they might not be used to, preparing them at home. If people get used to that, then they might be more comfortable long term. And I think those are the kind of things that can have these really lasting consequences for good and bad. Or things around people maybe being more comfortable with seafood delivery. Like you don't usually think about someone pulling up on the scooter with a fresh fish from a restaurant being like a classic seafood delivery or food delivery option. But if people get more and more comfortable with that, that might be the case moving forward, that people just, feel more comfortable with that. And that might change some of the landscape around how people market fish, whether from a restaurant side or from other modes of demand. So I think I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of questions there. And those are probably the most interesting ones of what might stick around beyond just some initial blip of whether that be on the demand side or the production side. So thinking about things like aquaculture, which might allow you to produce products in a way that might let you be a little more robust to these types of shock events. So a lot of things to unpack there, but it's a very, very good set of questions.
Great, thank you. Well, we're about out of time, so I would just like to say thank you on behalf of the Gund Institute and everyone else who joined us online. Thank you so much, Easton, for your talk today, and for everybody who tuned in. We appreciate you engaging with us in this important conversation. And we'll have the video and podcast of today's talk available for everybody next week. Please join us again next Friday for our next Gund Exchange with Ellen Martinson from University of Vermont, who will be talking about emerging wildlife disease threats in a human-altered world. In addition, this is a reminder for everybody that we have the Gund Community Social right after today's talk, so we hope to see you there. And thank you so much, everybody, and see you next week.